Hi, everyone.
Greetings. In our last video, based on the track, The Cost of Discipling, we're talking about the cost of competence and incompetence in the previous sections, and we're still in the cost of competence. And we made the point in the last segment that whether you're feeding at Jehovah's Witnesses table or the average evangelical table, you have problems. And those problems relate to, is the food pure? Is the food potent? Does it have potency? And is it even palatable? Mm-hmm. And the Watchtower, of course, has both for the first two problems. That is, it's not potent food. It's not going to do you any good ultimately. And it's not pure. It's grossly impure. But those problems exist in many other situations, religious situations on this planet. How do they make it palatable then? We dealt with that in the last segment. So we're going to read over the joining paragraph here before we get into the new material. We're going to be reading from the screen too, so if we look distracted, there's the reason.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What can we do to protect ourselves and our spiritual dependence? First, let us evaluate our sources and resources. Most people in Western democracies get their information from the media, especially television and internet. Most of their opinions about everything are filtered and controlled by the media. Their opinions and sentiments are also, to a great extent, controlled by their sources. If their sources are biased and unbalanced, so too will be those who depend upon them.
But if we are what we eat, then how can we get out of the trap in which most non-specialists find themselves? We are increasingly like the poor dog under the table, scrounging whatever scraps drop in our vicinity. This is an age of specialization. As the 20th century ended, most of us were in a very precarious position in trying to understand the world we live in. Even specialists, that is, scholars, are not exempt from this truth. We know more and more about less and less. Facts and theories are confused. Understanding decreases as knowledge exponentially increases. Even the notion of relevance swept away before a tsunami of trivia. How can the concerned Christian ever navigate through the ocean of information which engulfs the modern consumer? Can we separate the wheat from the chaff? Well, the good news is that other seekers have anticipated the need and risen to meet it. In secular circles, that means there have appeared numerous helps as our information age progressed, helping the average guy find the best books in important categories. The best in literature, both classical and modern, the best in history, with recommendations for all periods, the best in music and recordings, classical and modern, jazz, blues, rock, country, etc. Each have their own what to listen to volumes.
In Christian circles, we have also seen a welcome profusion of works on best books, authored often by famous Christian educators and scholars. These books will normally suggest priority recommendations in the major categories of Christian study: Old and New Testament, theology, church history, worship, missions, apologetics, and much more.
So we need not shrug in existential despair. It does not take extreme effort to find 2 or 3 recommendations in any category of knowledge we seek to explore. The problem, it seems, is more that we have become mentally lazy. It is far easier to hit a search button on the computer than to take the trouble to find reputable sources. Far easier to let a search engine prioritize than to learn to do it ourselves. But there is a cost attached to this online research habit. At best, we will find sources we will not find elsewhere. At worst, we find sources which will not be high on any objective list of reliable, unbiased witnesses. And often even Christian sources will be just as, if not more, unbalanced than the sources conservative Christians would never touch because of their so-called liberal bias. So next time we'll get more into the online problem, but we wanted to kind of antidote all of this by showing you some of the helps that we ran into very early in our leaving the Watchtower, we jumped right into the book business, and then we were finding books that recommended books, and we just wanted to show you today.
We didn't have internet in those days either.
There goes the mouse.
Yeah.
So here's some of the books that we used very early on to grade books, because it became obvious to us what we just said in this document, that Christians were having trouble prioritizing. Often they would just take what some pastor or some friend recommended to them as being the book on Genesis, or the book on Matthew, or the book on Revelation. That was a very common thing that we bumped into right away. But where do you go to get good recommendations? Well, you go to people who've stood the test of time. Here's a few of the ones we used a lot in those early days and still use. Charles Spurgeon, way back in the 1880s, wrote this book, Commenting and Commentaries. So that one you can get for free, PDF version, but it shouldn't be too hard to find a paperback or this hardcover edition, where you have the books that were already famous in the 1880s as recommended reading by one of the most famous preachers of the day. And this man, Wilbur Smith, whose library, by the way, formed the core of the library at Fuller Seminary when it was founded in the 1940s. He wrote, I've got 4 of his books on bibliography. Here's one of them, maybe the most famous of them.
Read the title. A
Treasury of Books for Bible Study. Now, don't worry about writing these things down as we talk about them, because we'll send you the list if you ask for it.
And we'll put the names of these authors, anyways, in the description.
Yeah, Wilbur Smith wrote 4 books. This one, he has a good list of basic commentaries, etc. Anyway, Wilbur Smith was an immeasurable help to us in putting together our personal library.
Yeah.
D.A. Carson, this is not the latest edition. This is the edition I worked from back 30 years ago. There's always new editions of this coming out. D.A. Carson, New Testament Commentaries Survey. I think the latest edition was just a few years ago. So Carson's always up to date with what is the best in any category. So if you want to know what's the latest, Carson is a great source. But he also has lists of the classic books. Of course, you need a balance. The classics are often good at some stuff, for instance, devotional reading and the meat, as it were, but you need a new commentary to balance it. And Carson will tell you what the best new stuff is for updated archaeological information, word studies, etc. And correspondingly, there's Tremper Longman III on the Old Testament. And he's also putting out new editions of this book, Old Testament Commentary Survey, Tremper Longman III. Both Carson and Longman are still alive, as well as I know. So they're constantly updating their work. Cyril Barber isn't alive anymore, but if there was one book that did me more good in those days than any other, it was these 2 volumes, The Minister's Library. The red one at the bottom is the original, and this was an update. The blue one was an update in the 1980s of what he had put out in the original in the 1970s. And he has not just books on the Bible. He has books on everything that's of relevance to the Christian minister or to a Christian worker at all. Very conservative, as are Carson and Longman. Longman less conservative, I would say, but Carson's quite conservative. So is Barber. And they all have their biases, of course, their theological biases. But when you've got a few of these, you can get a sense of what those biases are. And then there's Warren Wiersbe that we've talked about before. And we have 3 or 4 of his books on books. And this is one of them, Walking with the Giants. Yeah, Listening to the Giants was another one you used a lot, right?
Yeah, so the reason I really liked his books was I wasn't at a really high scholarly level. So I liked the fact that he was giving you, in one of his books, he actually gives you recommendations and then a sample. So, and it was usually a preacher. It was usually one of the old-time famous preachers, F.B. Meyer, people like that he would tell you about, and then he would give you a sample of their writing. So for me, that was helpful because I could get a little taste for their style of writing, the way they spoke, and if it appealed to me, then I could read more of their their materials. But yeah, we based our library on a lot of the recommendations from these various books from various places, various denominations, right?
Yeah, they're coming from various denominational angles, not to mention prejudices when it comes to theology, but they're not claiming to be the absolute truth on any given subject. By the way, if you think you've seen some of those covers before, it probably is because you have. Yeah. If you look at the masthead on our channel, you'll see these books, but you'll also see about 40 others, and they were all on this shelf, by the way, for a special photograph that Max took, and you'll get an idea of the range, because when we did our own bibliographies much later, we used these 6 or 7 books, plus we used another 40, 50, 60, I don't know how many. But if you want the whole list, we can send it to you. Just send us an email, you can find that on our channel information.
What I also found was when I was reading, a lot of times these books were far enough back that they were contemporaries of Russell and Rutherford. Yeah. And what I found with reading them, that these men were very wide-ranging in what they knew. So it was obvious that they were themselves well-read people. So they would quote things in history. They would quote poetry and literature. And I felt so starved after I left the Watchtower, and so stupid a lot of the time, that I didn't know. I had never sampled, I never concentrated on anything except the Watchtower stuff. So I was not a good reader back then. So I was introduced to literature and poetry, and all of those things took on more flavor in my life.
Yeah.
Not just biblical studies, but music and film, and we had more time for it, and you gain so much. You become a more interesting person, and your curiosity just keeps being fed by the people you're reading.
And the riches never run out. That's one thing we learned really fast, that we'll never be able to read all the books that are recommended by those guys in our lifetime. Most of us will not be able to do it, but we should at least be aware that they're there, the great range of material Christ has given to the church. And by the way, one more point about all of this is you don't have to pick and choose among them. You don't have to play favorites with any of these guys, because they all have various gifts and various enthusiasms. And the older the books, don't think that the old ones are less valuable, because, as Vivian just said, they have a certain advantage over the newer guys in this ultra-specialized age where you have not New Testament scholars, but you have John scholars, you have Synoptic Gospel scholars, you have Paul scholars. There's just no way the average person, even the average seminarian, can keep up with what's out there.
The amount of new material.
Let's say on the Gospel of Matthew, there's just so much to read that you can barely keep up with it, let alone and the new stuff. You can't even keep up with the new stuff, let alone explore what's been there before. So the advantage of the old guys like Spurgeon and Wilbur Smith, and even Barber to an extent, is they predate in their choices the age of specialization.
And I think the big difference too is you will find the older writers, I always find they have, well, not all of them, but they have more warmth and more practicality. Sometimes the way they write is more given to daily situations, whereas a lot of times scholars give you wonderful information, but it can be a little dry. So it's like one scholar writing to another. So it tends to take a different level. It's maybe higher in information. Yeah,
generally speaking, the newer the book, the more they're writing to their level of intellect and their level of research. In other words, Carson is writing to seminarians, people who have to study these things for their degrees, etc., or pastors anyway. But the older guys tended to aim at the
people they're
the regular
ministering
people
to.
like us.
Yeah, the lay people.
The lay people. So the intelligent, curious lay people were the target audience a lot of the time. And that's one of the casualties of our age of information, isn't it? We've moved on, not necessarily in the positive direction.
Yeah.
What are our links?
We're linking to a series of 3 videos I did on my re-education after the Watchtower. So we'll put the first one up. And there's 3 in that series. And the playlist he gave teachers.
He gave teachers. That's up to, I think, about 1,650 videos now, where we plug somebody or other of all these people that have blessed us over the decades.
Yeah, rich resources.
See you next time.
Okay.